The gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to our distinguished colleague from Texas, Chairman of the Ag Committee, Mr. Combest.
Thank you, Mr. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in very strong opposition to this resolution. As the chairman of the Committee on Agriculture, I know how essential exports are to farmers and ranchers across the United States, but more importantly, U.S. farmers and ranchers recognize the importance of trade to their own success. Withdrawing from the WTO would have the effect of isolating American producers from the rest of the world. For an industry that exports 30% of its production, a resolution such as this would have a devastating impact. If the House supports this resolution, the effect will be that the United States will be applying economic sanctions to the world, and we know who feels the effect of economic sanctions first. It's the American farmer and rancher. There are three things that can happen when agricultural sanctions go into effect, and they're all bad. Exports go down, prices go down, and farmers and ranchers lose their share of the world market. 1980 grain embargo to the Soviet Union is one of the examples of the effects of sanctions on U.S. agriculture. Our wheat sales were lost, while France, Canada, Australia, and Argentina stepped in and sold wheat to the former Soviet Union. h.j.res 90 can have the same or more devastating impact on American agriculture. U.S. farmers and ranchers provide much more than is consumed in the United States, and therefore exports are vital to the prosperity of the American farmer and rancher. The WTO is not a perfect organization, and congressional oversight is essential and needed. Nevertheless, it is superior to previous organizations, and American agriculture recognizes this. Negotiations to further improve access to markets around the world and eliminate export subsidies are now going on. Since the end of World War II, 8 rounds of negotiations have reduced the average bound tariff on industrial goods from 40% to 4%. Meanwhile, bound agricultural tariffs remain at an average of about 50%. If agriculture is to ever catch up, it is essential to keep the U.S. a part of the negotiating process to convince our trading partners to talk about further reforms in agriculture. U.S. membership in the WTO is necessary to continue this progress. I urge my colleagues to reject h.j.res 90 for the future of American agriculture. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself 30 seconds. I would like to respond to the gentleman from Texas. This is not an issue of trade. This is an issue of who gets to manage and decide whether it's fair trade or not. It's the issue of power, whether it's by the international bureaucrats or by the U.S. Congress. The one thing under this arrangement, the little farmer has very little say. He can't get into the WTO and make a complaint. The great meat packers of the country may well. I would like to now yield my 4 minutes to the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Metcalf.
The gentleman from Washington is
Thank you, Mr.
recognized
Speaker.
for 4 minutes.
Thank you. The U.S. membership in WTO violates our Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution delegates to Congress the sole authority to, and I quote, regulate commerce with foreign nations. Our membership in WTO transfers authority to regulate trade to a foreign body. It removes it from our elected representatives, this Congress. This Congress does not have the authority to set aside such constitutional requirements. In its 1998 decision regarding the line item veto, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress cannot divest itself of duties delegated to it by the Constitution unless the Constitution is amended. The U.S. Constitution has not been amended to allow the international organizations like the WTO to regulate American trade policies. Therefore, Congress cannot divest itself of the duty to regulate commerce with foreign nations. I believe the WTO is an entirely non-legitimate international organization. Many of its member states do not represent the people of their country. They represent the single will of the sovereign of their country. The American Congress gets its legitimacy from the people of the United States. It cannot grant legitimacy to an international body over and above that of our own citizenry. To suggest by our membership that the WTO is legitimate, we must ignore our people, our citizenry, and our Constitution. However, it seems that sovereignty or legitimacy are no longer issues that many in this Congress want to address. It seems as though the rule of law is no longer an issue that many in this Congress want to address. It seems as though strictly adhering to the provisions of our Constitution is no longer an issue that many in this Congress want to address. Instead, economic power and the accumulation of wealth seem to occupy increasing amounts of attention these days. America's legitimacy rests solely in its citizens' good offices as the sole sovereigns of this country. If this Congress does not protect American sovereignty, then who will? If this Congress does not reaffirm the rule of law, then who will? Well, it's we in this Congress must reassert the constitutional directive that Congress must have the sole authority over America's trade with foreign nations. Vote yes proudly on H.J.R. 90. Remove this nation from the unconstitutional jurisdiction of the WTO. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself 15 seconds. The Financial Times does support the WTO, but this is what they said after PNTR was passed. Already, many Washington trade lawyers are smacking their lips at the thought of the fees to be earned from bringing dispute cases in the WTO against Chinese trade practices. Says one, what will China be like in the WTO? It's going to be hell on wheels. Close quote. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McKinney.
Gentlelady from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The World Trade Organization is in need of serious reform. Interestingly, while Western economists are proclaiming that foreign investment and trade have been a blessing for the world's poor, we hear quite a different message coming from the poor themselves. The recent meeting of developing countries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, known as the G15, saw host Hosni Mubarak say that despite assurances early on that globalization would lead to an improvement in living standards, instead, imbalance in the world economy is increasing instead of decreasing. In fact, in 1999, 45% of the world's income went to the 12% of the world's people who live in rich industrial nations. The 3 richest Americans own more than the world's 20 poorest countries. Developing countries were sold a bill of goods, but so were we. Corporations, with the help of the WTO, have forced workers throughout the world into a deadly game of chicken. The WTO should protect basic social services and prioritize human rights and the environment in an environment that is democratic and transparent. Instead, it hurts the poor, benefits the rich at the expense of us all, and it does it in the secret and in back rooms. This is no way to build a new world order. We need to put our money where our professed values are: fair trade, democracy, respect for workers, sensible environmental standards, and allowing poor countries to grow. I've introduced the Corporate Code of Conduct Act because I don't think that freedom, equality, human dignity, and human rights are for sale. Unfortunately, the folks at WTO don't agree. They have unleashed unbridled corporate excess on all of us. The current system is wrong and in need of a serious fix. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution.
And Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak against the resolution which would undermine U.S. markets abroad for billions of dollars of U.S. agricultural products. The WTO provides member states with a set of rules that open markets to U.S. agricultural, industrial products and services. And at the heart of the WTO rules-based trading system is the WTO dispute resolution system, which keeps trade disputes from escalating into trade wars. From the agricultural point of view, the WTO dispute resolution is working to expand market opportunities around the world. A recently reported victory on Korean beef that add about $35 million a year in U.S. sales to that country. The WTO has sanctioned retaliation of over $300 million against the European Union on beef and bananas. It has expanded varieties of U.S. fruit exports to Japan. It has increased exports of U.S. pork and beef by pressuring Korea to modernize shelf life restrictions. Dispute resolution has improved the European Union grain importation regulations that have benefited U.S. rice exports. It has reduced Hungarian export subsidies. And I can go on with significant victories for United States agricultural product. It ruled, for example, against a Canadian dairy export subsidy scheme before it could be copied in Europe. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we need the WTO dispute resolution system to keep opening markets for U.S. agricultural products, and we need the WTO. A strong vote against House Joint Resolution 90 will send an important signal to our trading partners that America is ready to lead a new round of WTO negotiations.
The gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 30 seconds. I would like to say to the gentleman from Texas that the giant meat packers may well be represented at the WTO, but the small rancher and the farmer will not be. The same people who promote this type of international managed trade where we lose control and it's delivered to an international bureaucracy are the same ones who fight hard to prevent us trading with Cuba and selling our products there. I now would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The WTO is a majestic dream that predictably will become the American people's worst nightmare. The lure of more open trade with hundreds of countries is being used as a disguise for an awesome transfer of power and authority that will, in the long run, ill serve the interests of the American people. Let us recognize that this is not about whether there should be or shouldn't be trade. That's a nonsensical argument. America is the world's largest market, and there will always be countries clamoring for commerce with the American people. The question is, how will we trade, and what will be the procedure that we trade with these countries? The question is if we, through our democratic processes and bilateral agreements negotiated by elected officials, people elected by the people of the United States, will be setting the ground rules for this trade, or whether it will be controlled by international boards, commissions, and committees of the WTO. And let us admit, yes, third world countries and developing countries will probably have more open markets to American and multinational corporations if this WTO goes through and keeps going on. That trade potential, let me point out, is minuscule. We're talking about trade with a bunch of countries like Rwanda, or like tiny countries in Paraguay and Latin America, as compared to large developing countries. We're going to trade, we're going to give up our rights here in this country to determine our own economic destiny, to open up the markets of these tiny little countries. That's ridiculous. So there is an economic downside if we don't go through with WTO. Yeah, it's a minimal downside. But the potential downside in terms of the loss of the American people to control their own destiny is staggering. Predictably, the boards, commissions, and the rest of the decision-making apparatus of the WTO will, within a decade or two, be dominated by the same crooks and despots who now control so many of these third-world countries that refuse to open up their markets. And that bribery and corruption will come with this centralization of power. There is no doubt about that. You try to predict that that's not going to happen, give me a break. Idealistic globalism is today the greatest threat to freedom and liberty in this country for the people of this country. We should not be transferring power and authority to an unelected, appointed international bureaucracy, and that's what the WTO is all about. Can one foresee a country like Communist China bribing? I would ask for an additional minute. Can one foresee that a country, a powerful country like Communist China, bribing WTO commissioners in the future? How about multinational corporations? Will they try to influence decisions that dramatically impact the standard of living of American people without any protection of our own elected officials? You can bet on it. And you can also bet that they're going to try to just do that and that we won't have anything that we can do about it. Yet we will have little recourse in this whole situation except to quit. I opposed PNTR with Communist China. Now, because it's a dictatorial system, now we are being eased into a system that will mandate that every despotic regime in the world be treated equally with democratic societies. The WTO plan is a blueprint for bolstering tyrannical regimes throughout the world. Trade will not turn the hearts of these despots, or they will not make honest people out of corrupt officials who end up with power. Please, I ask you to support this. I ask you to support this resolution. Do not sacrifice American liberty on the altar of globalism.